On my 30th birthday, my mother-in-law handed me divorce papers with a smile. "You're no longer needed, Rebecca," she said. But what she didn't know was that I had been planning this moment for months. See, sometimes the best gift isn't what's wrapped in pretty paper. It's what's hidden in plain sight. I'm Rebecca Martinez, 32 years old, and I work as a financial analyst specializing in fraud investigation. For the past 3 years, I thought I had the perfect life with my husband, David. Perfect house, perfect job, perfect family dinners every Sunday with his mother, Margaret. But perfection, I've learned, is often just a well-constructed lie. The birthday party was exactly what you'd expect. Streamers in the living room, homemade cake on the dining table, and David's entire family gathered around our mahogany dinner table. Margaret had insisted on hosting it at our house, which should have been my first red flag. She never liked giving up control of anything, especially not in what she still called her son's house, despite both our names being on the deed. "Rebecca, darling," Margaret said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness I'd grown accustomed to, "I have something very special for you this year." She placed an elegantly wrapped box in front of me, cream-colored paper with a gold bow that probably cost more than most people's entire gift budget. The way she smiled, though, made my stomach turn. It was too wide, too perfect, like a politician's campaign photo. I should have known something was wrong when she smiled too wide, but I was still playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law. "Oh, Margaret, you didn't have to get me anything special," I said, already reaching for the ribbon. David sat beside me, unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on his phone instead of watching me open the gift. The room fell silent as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like it was something precious, were legal documents, divorce papers, with David's signature already scrawled across the bottom in his familiar handwriting. I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I lifted the papers with trembling hands, scanning the text that essentially erased 3 years of my life. "You're no longer needed in this family," Margaret announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "David has found someone who actually appreciates what we can offer." The other family members, David's sister Lisa, his uncle Tom, even his grandmother Rose, just sat there, watching like this was dinner theater they'd paid to see. Have you ever felt completely humiliated in front of people you trusted? That moment when you realize everyone in the room knows something you don't, and they're all waiting to see how you'll break? That's exactly where I was supposed to be. That's what they expected. But as I stared at those papers, I felt something they didn't expect. Relief. Pure, crystalline relief. Because for the past 6 months, I had been documenting everything, and this birthday gift was just the final piece of evidence I needed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the papers back in Margaret's face like any normal person would have. Instead, I smiled. A real smile. Not the fake one I'd been wearing for months. "Thank you, Margaret," I said quietly, folding the papers and placing them back in the box. "This is exactly what I needed." The confusion on their faces was priceless. David finally looked up from his phone, his eyebrows furrowed like he was trying to solve a math problem. "Rebecca, we should talk about this privately." "Oh, we will," I assured him, standing up from the table. "We definitely will." I looked around the room at all the faces staring at me, memorizing this moment. Thank you all for coming to my birthday party. I think I'll remember this one for the rest of my life. Sometimes the best revenge is letting them think they've won. Because I had been documenting everything, every suspicious phone call, every unexplained expense, every weekend work trip that didn't quite add up. And now, thanks to Margaret's theatrical presentation, I had witnesses to the premeditated nature of this entire setup. I excused myself from the room, listening to the nervous chatter that erupted behind me. In the hallway, I could hear Margaret's voice rising. Well, that went better than expected. I thought she'd make a scene. David's response was muffled, but I caught the words, "easier this way," and Jessica can move in next week. Jessica. Finally, a name to go with the phone number I'd been tracking for months. Would you have stayed to hear what they said about you? I almost did. Part of me wanted to know exactly how long they'd been planning this, how many family dinners I'd sat through while they discussed my disposal like I was an outdated piece of furniture. But I had work to do. See, here's what they didn't know about Rebecca Martinez. I don't just investigate financial fraud for my clients, I investigate it for myself, too. And 6 months ago, when David started coming home late and his credit card statements started showing charges at restaurants I'd never been to, my professional instincts kicked in. I'm very good at my job. I've helped dozens of women discover their husbands' hidden assets during divorce proceedings. I've traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts. I've uncovered affairs that were funded through joint checking accounts. What I'd never done was use those skills on my own marriage. Until I did. You know that feeling when everything suddenly makes sense? When all the little inconsistencies you've been ignoring suddenly form a clear picture. That's what happened when I started digging into David's financial activity. The pieces started falling into place, one bank statement at a time. The work conferences that required cash advances. The new credit card he'd opened without telling me. The way he suddenly became interested in reorganizing our finances and suggested I focus on my own career instead of our joint investments. Even the way Margaret started being extra nice to me, like she was trying to make up for something in advance. I'd seen this pattern before in my professional life. It's called financial infidelity, and it almost always precedes the regular kind. So I did what I always do when I suspect fraud. I started keeping records. Every conversation, every receipt, every inconsistency got logged into a secure file on my laptop. But I wasn't just playing defense. See, I'd spent 3 years of my life helping other women in situations exactly like this one. Women who'd been blindsided by divorce papers they never saw coming, left scrambling to protect assets they didn't even know they had a right to. I'd learned from their mistakes. Sometimes the best revenge is patience. Because while David was busy planning his exit strategy with Jessica Thompson, yes, I knew her full name, her address, and exactly how much money he'd spent on their little affair. I was planning something else entirely. And I had documented everything, bank transfers, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, even the apartment lease he'd signed for Jessica downtown. What they thought was their perfect crime was actually just evidence for the case I was building against them. For 6 months, I'd been playing the role of the unsuspecting wife while building an airtight legal strategy. I'd quietly consulted with Sarah Wilson, a divorce attorney who specialized in high-asset cases involving fraud. I'd photographed every document I could get my hands on. I'd even started recording conversations after I discovered David had been lying about his business trips. Was it sneaky? Absolutely. Was it legal? According to Sarah, perfectly legal in our state as long as I was protecting my own interests. Was it necessary? After tonight's performance, I'd say it was essential. The money trail led exactly where I expected it to lead. David had been funneling money from our joint accounts to pay for Jessica's apartment, her credit cards, even her student loans. He'd used our home equity line of credit to buy her a car. And Margaret, she'd been helping him hide it all, even offering to loan him money that came directly from the account she shared with David's father. Guess who the money was really going to? Not just Jessica, but a whole elaborate lifestyle David had been building for his post-Rebecca future. The downtown apartment, the weekend trips, the expensive dinners. It was all being funded by the marriage he was planning to escape. But here's where it gets interesting. David wasn't just cheating with Jessica Thompson, his subordinate at the marketing firm where he worked. He was planning to leave the company with her and start their own business, using our money, using connections he'd made through our joint social circle, using credit that was backed by assets that were legally mine. Have you ever been replaced before you even knew it? Because that's exactly what was happening. Jessica wasn't just his mistress, she was his business partner, his future wife. And apparently, according to Margaret, the daughter I always wished I'd had. The plot was almost impressive in its scope. David would file for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences. Margaret would testify that I'd been difficult and unwilling to compromise. Jessica would console him through his difficult transition, and I would be left with whatever scraps the lawyer could negotiate, probably a small settlement and maybe half the furniture. They had it all figured out, except for one tiny detail. The house David thought he owned, the one where tonight's humiliation had taken place, the one where Jessica was supposed to move in next week. I'd been quietly documenting irregularities in how it was purchased. And 3 months ago, when David suggested we refinance to get a better rate, I'd done something he didn't expect. I'd read every single page of every single document before signing, and I'd noticed some very interesting language about ownership percentages and asset protection that David clearly hadn't bothered to understand. Language that, combined with the evidence I'd been gathering about his financial infidelity, made my legal position much stronger than anyone in that dining room could have imagined. The best revenge is legal revenge, because technically, due to some very specific clauses in our refinancing agreement and the way our assets were structured, I owned 75% of everything we'd built together. The house, the investments, even the business assets David thought he was so cleverly hiding. Margaret's birthday gift hadn't just given me grounds for divorce. It had given me grounds for a fraud investigation. And in our state, financial fraud during marriage doesn't just affect the divorce settlement. It affects everything. As I sat in my home office that night, listening to David and his family celebrating downstairs like they'd just pulled off the heist of the century, I opened my laptop and reviewed the files I'd been building for 6 months. Bank records, email screenshots, photos of documents, audio recordings of conversations where David explicitly discussed hiding assets from me. Because technically, I owned 75% of everything, and they had just handed me a signed confession that this had all been premeditated. Margaret's dramatic presentation wasn't just cruel, it was evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The morning after my birthday party, I woke up in the guest bedroom. David had moved to the couch, apparently too ashamed to face me directly. I could hear him on the phone downstairs, probably with Jessica, planning their next move. What he didn't know was that while he was making his morning calls, I was making one of my own. "Sarah Wilson, attorney at law," came the crisp voice on the other end of the line. "Sarah, it's Rebecca Martinez. Remember that case we discussed hypothetically 6 months ago? Well, it's not hypothetical anymore." I explained the birthday party incident while photographing the divorce papers with my phone. "They just handed me everything I need." Sarah's laugh was sharp and professional. "Rebecca, they've made this almost too easy. With the premeditation angle and the financial fraud evidence you've gathered, this isn't just a divorce case anymore. This is potential criminal fraud. How soon can you come in? How about now? What would you do with this kind of power?" Because as I sat in Sarah's office an hour later, spreading out 6 months of evidence across her conference table, I realized I wasn't just holding David's future in my hands. I was holding the key to completely restructuring what they thought was going to be their victory. "Here's what most people don't understand about divorce law," Sarah explained, pointing to the refinancing documents I'd brought. "When one party commits financial fraud during the marriage, it doesn't just affect the asset division, it can invalidate agreements, trigger penalty clauses, and in your case—" She smiled, the same kind of smile I imagined a chess master makes when they see checkmate in 3 moves. "It means you're not actually bound by any divorce proceedings initiated through fraudulent means." The technical details were beautiful in their simplicity. The prenup David thought protected him, invalid due to fraud. The divorce papers he'd had me served with at my birthday party, null and void because they were based on hidden assets and false financial disclosure. The joint accounts he'd been draining, I could freeze them immediately under spousal protection laws. But the real masterpiece was the house. When we'd refinanced 3 months ago, David had been so eager to lower our monthly payments that he'd signed documents without reading them. Documents that transferred primary ownership to me in case of any fraudulent activity by the other party. It was a standard protection clause that most people ignore, but as a financial analyst, I never ignored anything. So legally, Sarah continued, you're not getting divorced until you choose to get divorced. And until then, everything he's done with marital assets constitutes theft. I spent the morning in Sarah's office, and by noon we'd filed 3 separate legal actions. A restraining order against asset disposal, a fraud investigation request with the district attorney's office, and a motion to freeze all accounts pending investigation of financial crimes during marriage. But I wasn't done yet. The revenge wasn't just going to be legal, it was going to be complete. At 2 p.m., I drove to David's office. I'd called ahead and confirmed he was in meetings all afternoon, which gave me plenty of time to have a very interesting conversation with his boss, Michael Thompson. Yes, Thompson, Jessica's father, though she'd never mentioned that little family connection to David. Mrs. Martinez, Michael said, shaking my hand in his corner office. I have to say I was surprised to get your call. David mentioned you two were having some difficulties. That's actually why I'm here, I said, placing a folder on his desk. I thought you should know that your daughter Jessica and my husband have been conducting an affair using company resources, and they're planning to steal client lists and proprietary information to start a competing business. Michael's face went through several interesting color changes as he opened the folder. Inside were printed emails between David and Jessica discussing client contacts, proprietary marketing strategies, and yes, their plans to recruit key employees after they left. Michael's voice trailed off as he read, this is corporate espionage. That's what I thought too. I figured you'd want to handle this internally before it becomes a legal matter. I smiled sweetly, though I should mention that I've already filed a fraud report with the DA's office regarding the personal financial aspects of their relationship. Within an hour, David and Jessica were both called into separate meetings with HR. By 5 p.m., they were both escorted out of the building with their personal belongings in cardboard boxes. The company's legal team had moved fast. They'd been suspended pending investigation, and their access to all systems had been immediately revoked. Sometimes breaking means rebuilding stronger. Because while David thought he was destroying our marriage to build a new life, I was using the pieces to construct something much more powerful, complete financial and legal control over everything we'd built together. I got home before David did. When he finally walked through the door at 6:30, carrying his sad little box of desk trinkets, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. "We need to talk," he said, setting the box down heavily. "Yes, we do." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Please, sit down." He looked older somehow, like the events of the day had aged him 5 years. "Rebecca, I know you're angry about the birthday thing. Margaret thought it would be easier this way, but maybe we should have—" "David, stop." I held up one hand. "Before you say anything else, I need you to understand something. I've known about Jessica for 6 months. I've known about the money transfers, the apartment, the business plan, all of it. Last night wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation." His face went pale. "You knew?" "I'm a financial fraud investigator, David. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you stealing from our joint accounts?" I slid a paper across the table. "This is a summary of every fraudulent transaction you've made in the past 8 months. $47,000 total, in case you were wondering." He picked up the paper with shaking hands. I was going to pay it back." "With what money? The business you were planning to start with stolen client lists?" I watched his face crumble as he realized I knew about that too. "Oh, did I forget to mention? I had lunch with Michael Thompson today. Lovely man. Did you know Jessica never told you her father owns the company you both just got fired from?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, David looked up from the paper. "What do you want, Rebecca?" I want you to understand that those divorce papers Margaret gave me, they're worthless. You can't divorce someone while you're actively defrauding them. So legally, we're still married, and legally, everything you've done with our money constitutes theft from your spouse. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard we'd planted together 3 springs ago. All our accounts are frozen pending investigation. The house is solely in my name now due to fraud protection clauses in our refinancing agreement, and tomorrow morning a forensic accountant will start reviewing every financial transaction either of us has made in the past 2 years. Rebecca, please. Jessica's pregnant. She needs... I turned around sharply. Pregnant? This was new information. How pregnant? 3 months, he admitted quietly. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. 3 months pregnant meant conception right around the time David had started being extra attentive to me, bringing me flowers and suggesting romantic dinners. While he was getting another woman pregnant, he'd been playing the loving husband to throw off my suspicions. The best revenge is truth. And the truth was that David hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd been living a double life so complete that he'd made me an unwitting participant in funding his pregnant mistress. But I wasn't done yet, not even close. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Margaret. Rebecca, dear. Her voice was sickeningly sweet even over the phone. I hope you've had time to think about David's generous offer. I have, I said, and I'd like to invite you to lunch today. There are some things we need to discuss about the divorce proceedings. We met at the country club where Margaret held her weekly bridge games, surrounded by her social circle of wealthy retirees and their carefully maintained appearances. I'd chosen the location deliberately. Margaret valued her reputation above almost everything else. I have to admit, Margaret said, cutting into her salmon, I was impressed by how well you took the news yesterday. Very mature. Thank you, I replied, taking a sip of my wine. I've actually been thinking about maturity a lot lately, about patterns that get passed down through families, and how sometimes people hurt others because they've never learned healthier ways to handle conflict. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I'm not sure I follow. Well, for instance, I've been wondering about David's father, about why he moved out when David was 15 and never came back, about why you've been so invested in controlling David's relationships ever since. The color drained from Margaret's face. I don't know what you think you know, but I know that David's father left because he discovered you'd been having an affair with his business partner. I know that you used David as emotional support in ways that weren't appropriate for a teenage boy. And I know that you've been trying to recreate that dynamic by controlling who he marries and how he lives his life. Margaret set down her fork with a trembling hand. You have no right to. I also know, I continued calmly, that the money you've been giving David to support Jessica comes from the joint account you still share with your ex-husband, the account he doesn't know about because you convinced him it was closed after the divorce settlement. This was a gamble based on financial patterns I'd noticed, but Margaret's reaction confirmed I was right. Her perfectly composed mask slipped completely. How dare you investigate my personal finances? I didn't have to. David used that money to pay Jessica's credit card bills, and those transactions showed up in my fraud investigation. Your ex-husband's signature is on file with the bank, Margaret. All it would take is one phone call to let him know where his retirement money has really been going. Have you ever won something but felt empty? Because as I watched Margaret realize that her carefully constructed world was crumbling, I felt something I didn't expect: pity. She was a woman who'd been hurt deeply and had spent decades hurting others in response, creating cycles of pain that had damaged her son and now threatened to damage his unborn child. What do you want? Margaret whispered. I want honesty. I want you to call David and tell him that this divorce scheme was your idea, not his. I want you to admit that you manipulated him into believing our marriage was holding him back because you were afraid of losing control over him. And I want you to get therapy to deal with your own trauma instead of passing it on to the next generation. Margaret stared at me across the table, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the years of pain in her eyes. "And if I don't? Then tomorrow morning your bridge club is going to learn some very interesting things about how you've been financing your son's affair with stolen money. Your ex-husband is going to discover where his retirement fund went. And the IRS is going to get very curious about unreported income and tax evasion. Victory tastes like ashes sometimes. Because as I sat in that elegant dining room, surrounded by the soft chatter of women who probably had their own secrets and pain, I realized that destroying Margaret wouldn't actually heal anything. It would just create more damage, more cycles of hurt that would eventually reach David and Jessica's unborn child. Revenge cuts both ways. The power to destroy someone completely is also the power to show mercy, to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. And that's when I had to make the hardest choice of this entire situation. 3 days later, David showed up at our front door at 8 p.m. I could see Jessica waiting in the car, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. He looked broken, completely, utterly broken, in a way that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "can we talk?" We sat on the front porch, the same place where he'd proposed 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "I know you could destroy us," he began. "Margaret told me what you know about her finances, about my father, about everything. And I know you have every right to press charges and take everything and make sure I never recover from this." I waited, letting him continue. "But Jessica's scared. The baby... She needs medical care, and without insurance from the job we lost, she can't afford the specialists she needs. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Rebecca. I'm asking for mercy. What would you choose? Justice or compassion?" Because as I looked at this man who'd betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, who'd stolen from me and humiliated me and planned to discard me, I had to decide who I wanted to be in this moment. "David," I said finally, "do you understand that everything you did to me was a pattern you learned from your mother, that she taught you to manipulate and control people because she was never taught healthy ways to handle her own pain?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And do you understand that if you don't break that pattern, you're going to do the same thing to Jessica and your child that your mother did to you?" "Yes," he whispered. "Hurt people. Hurt people." Margaret had been hurt by her husband's abandonment and had spent decades trying to maintain control through manipulation. David had been hurt by his father's absence and his mother's emotional demands, and he'd learned to escape difficult situations by creating elaborate deceptions. Jessica was about to be hurt by the consequences of actions she'd only partially understood, and their child would grow up in whatever environment we created with our choices right now. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. "You're going to sign this settlement agreement. I keep the house and 80% of our assets. You get enough to support Jessica and the baby, but it comes with conditions." David opened the folder with shaking hands. "You both attend couples therapy and individual therapy for at least 1 year. You find jobs, different companies, different industries, and you rebuild your lives honestly. No more schemes, no more manipulation, no more using people." I stood up looking down at him. "Margaret is also going to therapy, and she's going to start making amends for the financial fraud she enabled. She's going to pay back your father and face the consequences of her actions." "And if we agree to all this, then I don't press criminal charges. Jessica gets to keep her baby's father out of prison. And maybe, just maybe, your child grows up in a family that's learned to handle conflict and pain in healthier ways than the generations before them. Sometimes breaking means rebuilding stronger, but sometimes it means choosing to build something entirely new from the ruins of what came before." The next morning, Rebecca Martinez started a new chapter of her life. I used my experience to launch a consulting firm that helped women protect their assets during difficult divorces. I started a support group for people dealing with toxic family dynamics, and I turned my birthday gift into the catalyst for breaking generational cycles of pain. The best revenge is becoming who you're meant to be. And that birthday gift from Margaret? It became the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to discover my own strength and choose compassion over vengeance. David and Jessica are still together. They're both in therapy, both working honest jobs, and they're raising their daughter to understand that conflicts can be resolved without deception or manipulation. Margaret sees her granddaughter once a week, supervised visits while she continues working through her own issues in therapy. And me? I learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies. It's transforming them into people who can't create new enemies. Sometimes the best revenge is truth, compassion, and the courage to break cycles that have been damaging families for generations. That's the real secret that would change everything. The power to choose healing over hatred, growth over destruction, and love over revenge.